Hello, Dr. Tan. You are the founder and chief scientific officer of American River Nutrition and a foremost expert on vitamin E. So thank you for coming back on our channel, and it's great to talk to you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for inviting me. This is always a pleasure to meet up with you and then chat and answer questions as I could. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Tan. So, Dr. Tan, the last time we spoke, we talked about GG, so which is another molecule that you've studied deeply. But today it would be great if we could take some time to go into the details of vitamin E. So,
Mhm.
particularly its different forms and the supplements that come from those forms. So, although we say vitamin E like it's a single chemical, it's actually a family of similar molecules. So would you
Mhm.
be able to introduce the different forms of vitamin E?
Yes, I'd love to. Um, in fact, the original concept that a chemical is an antioxidant comes from vitamin E. It has kind of like a head, and the head has an OH group, an hydroxyl group, and is able to prevent the fat from getting oxidized. And then it has a tail, which is what they call very lipid soluble. It pushed down into the membrane, and that's where it resides, and able to make the membrane, which is mostly fat, good. So that is the original idea of lipid antioxidant. And then people have branched it off to other non-lipid antioxidant, but that's a classic original concept. I'm still talking about that concept even to this day. Protein, fat, and carbohydrate can get oxidized, including nucleic acid, which is our DNA and all that. The easiest thing to get oxidized of these four groups are fat. So therefore, lipid antioxidant I consider the most important. So now you can wipe off the noise. And of it, vitamin E stands right up, not any of the other antioxidant people talk about. So now your question is, the vitamin E has to do with tocopherol and vitamin E has to do with tocotrienol. These are the only two classes, for each. The lone difference in these two are not in the head because they're antioxidant, but it's in the tail. The tail of a tocopherol is saturated, which means it's got no double bond and therefore slightly longer. And the tail of a tocotrienol has a shorter because it's got three double bonds. So if you think about this antioxidant, why do I mention it? If the tail is longer of a tocopherol, it sticks into the cell membrane deeper, anchors deeper, so therefore it cannot move around as fast. Think of the cell like a bean. And then the tocotrienol have shorter tail. It spins around much faster. It's still anchored into the membrane, but spins around much faster, approximately 50 times faster than tocopherol. So when all is said and done, what does it mean? To use an American metaphor, a tocopherol is like a policeman, a local policeman. It is circumscribe and take care of the entire town or city. A tocotrienol have a shorter tail, spins around the whole state. Where I live would be Massachusetts. So they will cover a bigger subset area, capturing the same, but will be covering a larger area. And hence the difference between a tocopherol having shorter tail is to cover a larger area, approximately 50 times more potent than that of tocopherol.
So there have been clinical trials of vitamin E, and some have looked at tocopherols and some have looked at tocotrienols. Could
Mhm.
you talk about what they've seen with those two different forms?
Thank you. The Tocopherols studies had begun earlier, probably like 40, 50 years earlier since its discovery in the 1929, 2022. So it's about 100 years ago from two UC Berkeley pediatricians when it was discovered. So a lot of his work on bringing the fetus to full term, the antioxidant property soon after, carrying on the study in fat, this and that, came up to the head in about 1990s, where there were lots of clinical study done with tocopherol, and they had huge done right in my state here in the Boston with Harvard University, where they get huge doses to men and women with large clinical trials. And these clinical trials, when the day is done, the simplistic thing that I can say would be, at best, the alpha tocopherol did not work. And at worst, it could possibly do some harm. The audience can Google, they can find out. The amount that they take is anywhere typically at 400 IU, which is approximately 300 milligram, to all the way to 1,000 IU, which is 600-700 milligrams, something like that. And when it didn't work, it was quite alarming because it could bring on the possibility of cancer, like breast and prostate cancer, and then also other cardiovascular, presumed positive, but actually it turned negative. And all these studies were published way into the 2000s, like that, when the studies were done. The tocotrienol was discovered about 40 years after tocopherol by the University Wisconsin professor Karashi, and he's still living, an elderly person. I talked to him from time to time like that. And there he first discovered that it would lower lipids, cardiovascular benefits, and then cancer. All of these are published by him and many other people like that. So when I came to the scene, I began to follow through with more studies leading to clinical trials. The trials are smaller in design, and in short, we did many studies on chronic conditions, very broad. And the chronic conditions that we studied, these are many different studies on prediabetes, diabetes, fatty liver disease, clearly chronic conditions, including cancer, and all these clearly unequivocally show that tocotrienol would mitigate the function of chronic conditions. So that's what we have seen. Now, so between these two groups of tocopherols and tocotrienol, which I mentioned to you the study, then there's a subgroup. The subgroup would be, you can find mixture of tocopherol and tocotrienol. So what do you do there? So in those, we discovered in the early 1990s, some of the studies we did, clinical study we did, it did not work. When in the animal study, the mixture of the two did work. When it did not work, we were troubled. And we are able to figure out the troubling part. And the troubling part was when tocopherol and tocotrienol were to be together, the tocopherol interferes, mitigates, fouled up the functions of tocotrienol. So in short, we decided thereafter, to the best we could, to conduct studies of tocotrienol in the absence of or in the very low level of tocopherol, so that its function is clearly differentiated without any interferences at all. So that would be these two, tocopherol and tocotrienol.
So, what are the best sources of tocotrienols? And since we want tocotrienols without too many tocopherols, preferably none.
Yes, this question that you said today, I got simple answers to that. It took me almost a 20 years span to actually figure this out. In my early years, something like 25 to 35 years ago, I looked at every possible plant sources I could find to find out what amount of tocotrienol and tocopherol are found in plant, and which one are higher, and which one have high tocotrienol and low tocopherol. And for the most part, if you look at plant, 90% of the time, or even more, they are containing tocopherol, little to any tocotrienol, sometimes maybe 1 to 3%. So nothing to write home about, almost all tocopherol, with 3 exceptions. In my searches, I found that you can find tocotrienol in rice. You can get from the brand of the rice, the brown rice, and also in palm. Is well known. You can find it in palm oil. And then the most recent, I almost did not find this in the plant annatto, specific to South America. Elsewhere we grow them. When people think of annatto, unlike rice and palm, is well known. Annatto is for color. In the Western construct, annatto is used to color cheeses, Dorito chips, macaroni and chips like that. It is seldom used in the Asian context. In South America, which is where it was found, they pound the annatto and put it in tortilla and to color pork meat, the skin, the casing of sausages red color. So if you go to South America, you'll see this, but it's not really common otherwise. So on these 3 sources that I found, rice and palm contain 25 to 50% tocopherol. So therefore they contain about 50 to 75% tocotrienol. Something, not a nothing, but it does contain the 25 to 50% tocopherol. In the annatto is very clear. Is 0% tocopherol and 100% tocotrienol. But the discovery of annatto, which I did on this, is much later. The rice and palm I discovered at least 15, 20 years before I discovered the annatto, which is why in my earlier study, I was troubled with I did not know at the time, Richard, that tocopherol interferes with the function. So I did the study. So people have talked to me and said, well, Dr. Tan is just pitching something on his marketing. They don't know what they're talking about. I've been studying this for 40 years. I want palm and rice to work. I was troubled that it did not work. You follow? And I was thinking that the tocopherol with the tocotrienol would be innocuous. But I found out it was not. And my colleague published a study in Journal of Nutrition 1997. The year is crystal clear in my mind. He removed the tocopherol from palm and from rice. Voila! The tocotrienol from rice and palm work when the tocopherol is removed. But naturally, palm and rice contain tocopherol. When they were together, it didn't work. So he proved that. And then because he removed the tocopherol, then he did another study. Only he did this. Nobody else did this. He used the rice and palm tocotrienol, and then he add back the alpha tocopherol. 10%, and then another group 20%, and then another group 30%, and then 50%. And when he did that, and then he kept the same amount of tocotrienol. He systematically saw the same amount of tocotrienol the function begin to drop until it completely didn't work. When the amount of tocotrienol is the same by just adding so he clearly showed the interference. And thereafter, we decided we will never do a study with tocopherol to check the function of tocotrienol. So that was so the 3 sources you asked would be rice and palm containing 25 to 50% tocopherol. The other parts would be tocotrienol, and for annatto is essentially 0% tocopherol. So that would be the annatto one, and the other one is more than a nuance. When we look at the tocotrienol in the annatto, it contains 90% delta tocotrienol and 10% gamma tocotrienol. Why do I tell this? If you look at the individual study of alpha, beta, delta, gamma tocotrienol people study, they separate them and then they study them. Delta tocotrienol is head and shoulder above all the other tocotrienol. And then almost a distant second would be gamma tocotrienol. And then the other one fades into oblivion. So therefore, if you have 4 tocopherol and 4 tocotrienol, and then you found one that is no tocopherol and only 2 tocotrienol, and then the one that is highest is 90%, the second one is 10%, it is so obvious to me. If we were to do clinical study, if it didn't work, then all cause of my 20 to 30 years of lifespan in doing research in tocotrienol then would be lost. And I decided that if it is lost, then it's fine. At least I know. And then I move on. Richard, this is so you can see my passion coming out. I wasn't doing this for anything else except to show, does it really work or not? If it's not, then I move to something else. And when it did, I realized I was not surprised thereafter when I conduct all the clinical studies with Annatto-Tocotrienol. They consistently and repeatedly work. So thank you so much for allowing me to make that clear continuum comment.
So we saw that tocotrienols have been used in multiple studies. So what is the highest kind of approved dose for vitamin E tocotrienols?
The approved vitamin E of tocotrienol is 300 milligrams, above which there will be diminishing return, and below which then more is better. So we have done it from 50, 100, 150, even 250 and 300 in different studies. And you can see the straight line going up. Much above 300 to 400, it begins to taper off. And at 500, 750 and 1500, it went down. We have done this in a human study, many animal studies like that. So from there, we judge that most of the tocotrienol is unable to absorb because you give it such a big slug at one time. However, for the first part, from 100 to 300 milligrams as it go up, we simply ask people to take it with a meal because vitamin E is lipid soluble, including tocotrienol, and the absorption is just fine like that. So it peaks at about 300 milligram. And for the audience, this could not come anytime better. Last month, there was a Japanese study. They gave people about 250 milligram vitamin E. So it's close enough to 300 milligram. And they only studied it for 14 days. It's very short. We usually conduct study anywhere shortest would be 1 month and typically 3 to 6 months. So this is 14 days, super short. We didn't do the study. We had nothing to do with the study. So they did the study using our tocotrienol. They found that in 14 days, the absorption of tocotrienol is much higher than that of tocopherol. So this is not mixed, just the tocotrienol itself. So I deem that at about 250, 300 to 400 max, the absorption is just fine. So that is what I consider the peak amount of tocotrienol to be taken at any one time.
So should vitamin E, so basically the tocotrienols, be free from tocopherols? So do tocopherols have a kind of a negative impact?
Yes, tocopherol has a negative impact. The simplistic way I say tocopherol have a negative impact would be this. Tocopherol have in the body what we call a transport protein, which means that it has a chaperone that takes the vitamin E into the gut that we consume dietarily into the body. And the other vitamin E, other tocopherol, other tocotrienol, it goes through by passive diffusion. Passive diffusion meaning that if you have a high sugar amount in a glass of water, and over time the sugar would dissolve, and then the sugar will go from the highest concentration to the lowest concentration. So that process is passive, is physical, and is by diffusion. Vitamin E, as in alpha tocopherol, it has an active transport protein. It's got a protein like a chaperone that takes it through, so it's not by active diffusion. So why do I mention that? So if you take vitamin E, as in tocopherol, it will have the right of passage. It goes right through, and the tocotrienol passively goes through. Therefore, if you wish to see the function of tocotrienol, then it's best not to have the alpha tocopherol there because it will preferentially absorb the first before the tocotrienol. And secondly, because of the way I describe it, the alpha tocopherol blocks the absorption of tocotrienol, and that's a real problem. It blocks. Now, If the audience flip it to their thinking, well, Dr. Tan, if that is, then it should be good for alpha tocopherol that you have a active transport like that. It is good if alpha tocopherol works. Because I told you the clinical study done in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1990s, they failed. Remember I said that? At best, it did not work. At worst, it can do harm. If it is, all right, then I'll forget about and bury all the tocotrienol. I'm not going to talk about that, but it didn't work. So the rite of passage did not guarantee that it would work. It only blocks the function of tocotrienol. So the second part is a problem to me.
So why are soybeans and palm oil not suitable when used in supplements?
First, you can see soybean oil, which in the US we call vegetable oil, and palm oil, which is grown mostly in Southeast Asia, like in Indonesia and Malaysia and other parts of the world on the equator like that. They are used because they are the least expensive vegetable oil to use. So it's easy for them to put in the filler. It costs nothing. They cost nothing to begin with, but they put the cheapest of the cheapest in. I do not recommend people to take a large amount of soybean oil. Scientists know this. They're very high PUFA, they call it PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid. We consume copious amount of this when we go out to restaurant to eat to use a cheap vegetable oil. And these are the high omega 6s, and so it causes imbalance between the omega 6s and omega 3. So I don't recommend it. It does not have any benefit, and it's consuming more vegetable oil. Why do I need that? I need less vegetable oil in my body. So it's high PUFA. And then palm oil have high saturated fat, SFA, saturated fatty acid. So therefore, I do not recommend people to take huge amount of soybean oil and palm oil because they contain high amount of PUFAs and SFA. So that's very simplistically, that's where I'm going with it.
How are fillers harmful to the human body?
Okay, thank you. Sometimes they use vegetable oil, like I mentioned, soybean oil and palm oil as fillers. Sometimes they use other fillers that are not soybean oil and palm oil, such as phospholipids, and then phospholipid at least is natural. Sometimes they put synthetic emulsifiers, and that would be polyethylene glycol. That almost sounds like the thing that we put in antifreeze in our car. Polyethylene glycol. You can Google about this, and then they have names like tween. They have named by polyethoxylate. So the audience and the consumer are confused. But if they Google polyethylene glycol, they'll find them. Why are they used? They're used because many lipid-soluble material are not easily absorbed in our body. So when they put this PEG, polyethylene glycol, they're able to wrap around the lipid material, lipid vitamin A, D, E, K, this kind of vitamin, and many other lipid nutrients. They wrap around it and it makes it go in the body. No question, it does that really well. I have problems with that. Not that going in is a bad idea. I have problem with that because I do not want people to put so much of these emulsifiers and filler in our body, particularly if they're synthetic. Why? Because if you read about these, high doses of these cause gastric problem. It causes people to have indigestion. It also digestive problem. It irritates the gut and upset the stomach. And if you just Google this, you'll find out. And plus, I have a personal feeling on it. I spent decades to discover something so beautiful, like Annatto-Tocotrienol. Why? And then I use physical method to extract the tocotrienol from annatto, meaning no chemical, no solvent, no nothing. And then just before I finish, I make the beautiful soft gel, and I deliberately at the end of it, I put in an emulsifier. Why would I want to do that before the consumer take it? So therefore, it's a philosophical. I would not do that. I simply ask the consumer to take it with a meal. So therefore, fillers and emulsifiers, to the extent possible, is never to be put in. And the Japanese study last month said that it absorbs just fine. So there's no need of anything needed. So therefore, the reason other people put in is to create the perception of the large soft gel containing a huge amount of the real McCoy when it doesn't. And as it turned out, it actually is detrimental, potentially detrimental to the consumer.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So, Dr. Tan, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure talking to you again.
Yeah, I would say, on summary, I would say this. If you look in the bottle, if it is not on the label of the bottle, then it's not in the bottle. So it is important to look for our trade name called Delta Gold. Next, the dosage, if it's higher than 300 milligrams, is a red flag. 2 to 300 milligrams seems to be ideal. If more is needed, you take it in divided dose and with a meal. And just remember, it should be from Annatto-Tocotrienol, not from palm or rice, and definitely not Tocopherols, which can come from many sources. Oftentimes, they are from soybean or corn oil. And so look for authentic tocotrienol product with not the exaggerated amount claim nor the exaggerated soft gel. The soft gel should be small oval shape, not oblong shape. And also look for tocotrienol that does not have fillers or unnecessary emulsifiers because it's not needed. And so if you can think about these 4 or 5 things I mentioned, you will probably not go wrong. And if it comes from a good source, it will say Delta Gold. Thank you so much, Richard, for allowing me to share this with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. Great talking to you again.